AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Our host brings you the leading minds in AI, sharing their story, their success, and their advice. Focusing on fast-tracking you to the top, AI in Action cuts through the hype to help you kickstart your data science career. To listen to the latest AI in Action podcast, head over to www.alldus.com/podcast or subscribe via iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Podcasts.
You're listening to AI in Action. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Our guest today is Su Huang. Su is the head of data strategy for Datavant. Su, welcome to the show.
Hi, JP. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure, Su. So let's start with yourself. Su, can you please give us a bit of an overview of your career journey, where you first got started, talk us through, your initial interests, some of the roles you've held along the way, and then take us up to your joining at Datavant.
I really think of my career in two different phases. After undergrad, I first worked in the finance industry. I was an investment banker for a few years, and then I moved into the investing world as a research analyst at a hedge fund. And I had been raised in my early childhood in communist China, and had always been fascinated by the American economic machine. And I think I really, started off my career in finance because I wanted to gain experience in the capital markets and help companies finance their growth. It wasn't until I started covering parts of the healthcare industry during my time at the hedge fund that I realized the number one problem facing the US economy is runaway healthcare spend. Healthcare is now, I think, 18% of US GDP and continues to grow at a really fast pace. I saw the opportunity to make an impact on an industry that I believe has so much room for improvement. So I went to get my MBA to make an industry transition to healthcare. After graduating from Stanford with my MBA, I spent the first 2 years in healthcare consulting, getting a grounding in what's a very, very complicated industry. And then I decided I wanted operating experience. So I joined what was then a startup genetic testing company called Invitae, which is now a pretty large publicly traded company. And I had various responsibilities during my 3 years there. Initially, I led Invitae's payer strategy as the company was just starting to engage with health plans to gain in-network status so that its genetic tests could be reimbursed for. And then as the company gained traction commercially, I led the client services team that engages with patients and providers and ultimately grew that to a team of about 50 people. As part of leading client services, I used a lot of data to really optimize staffing, design workflows, and generally ensure that service levels would meet demand and generate strong customer satisfaction. So Invitae is a pretty mission-oriented company with a goal to bring genetic information to the masses. And from my time there, I saw firsthand the utility of genetic information for informing medical guidelines and our overall understanding of disease. And I knew I wanted to focus more on health data and analytics, and specifically work at a company that's focused on making healthcare data useful for analytic purposes. And I found Datavant through that lens. So I've been at Datavant now for 2 years and have had various responsibilities there, which is pretty typical for most startups. Currently, I'm the head of data strategy, and I act as a subject matter expert with clients on health data and our ecosystem of partners. Specifically, I work with our customers to understand their business challenges and translate those challenges into data needs and help them find the right partners to work with who have the data and capabilities to help them fill a gap. And because of how fragmented data is in the healthcare industry, it's not always obvious where you can even find the data that you need to answer a particular question, right? So like if you think about your own health journey, you probably have a primary care doctor where you get routine checkups. Maybe, you've had some urgent care or ER visits over the last year. You go to your local pharmacy to pick up medication. You get lab testing. Well, all of this data sits in multiple different systems and organizations that don't easily connect together. And that's what Datavant is seeking to change. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I think that there's some common elements there to your career path, which are incredibly important. So I'd love to just get your take on that, and then we can talk about Datavant as a company.
Sure. Yeah. I think that looking back at the various jobs I've had throughout my career journey, some of the common elements are really, familiarity in using data to generate insights and tell a story. Um, Secondly, I've always had a desire to make an impact on society and work on really big, meaty challenges. And thirdly, I'm attracted to growth industries that are seeing a lot of disruption and innovation. I think that always provides for really interesting and unexpected career opportunities if you place yourself in the right industry that's seeing a lot of growth.
Absolutely. So tell us about Datavant. For anyone who's not heard of them before, what do you do as a company?
So, Datavant's mission and vision is really to connect the world's health data. And at the core, we're a software company. We have a set of software tools that enable privacy protecting linkage of data. So we enable organizations we work with to connect disparate data sets about a patient, create longitudinal patient histories without knowing that patient's underlying identity. The way our software works is that it removes specific identifiers about a particular patient and replaces it with a unique encrypted identifier for each patient in the data. And that encrypted identifier is called the Datavant patient key. And this key is unique to each patient, but doesn't contain any information that can be used to re-identify that patient specifically. So essentially, these patient keys act as a means to link de-identified patient records together from numerous data sources without compromising patient privacy.
And that's huge. But for anyone who's not familiar with the healthcare industry, can you explain why data exchange in healthcare is more challenging than most other industries?
Sure, I think it comes down to three major reasons. One, regulatory hurdles to exchanging healthcare data. Two, fragmentation of where the data resides, which is typically across many different industry players. And then three, you know, medical records were only fairly recently digitized. And as part of that digitization, we didn't really have nationwide standards for digital data interchange. So for all of those reasons are why data exchange is more challenging in healthcare, and I'm happy to dive into each of those reasons in a bit more detail.
Yeah, please do, because I think it'd be helpful for people who know that healthcare is a rapidly growing space for the use of data. But for anyone on the outside, it would be a good educational piece to understand some of the challenges that you're facing in a bit more detail.
Yeah, sure. So to speak a bit about the first reason that healthcare data exchange is challenging, it's really because of regulation, right? Like healthcare is a highly regulated industry, and the privacy of patient data is taken extremely seriously by all parties involved. So specifically, the regulation that governs all healthcare data is a regulation called HIPAA, which stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This federal law creates national standards to protect sensitive patient health information from being disclosed without the patient's consent. So this law defines very specific instances when patient health data can be shared and when it cannot be shared. And for the purposes of most general healthcare research or analytics, that patient data cannot be freely shared without the patient's consent unless it's first de-identified so that the patient remains anonymous. And that's where Datavant software comes into play. The second major reason, is that healthcare is very fragmented. Our industry is very much a patchwork system of healthcare delivery in this country. So literally the data about patients is everywhere. Patient data wasn't even routinely captured in digital format in this country until the High-Tech Act of 2009, which really led clinicians to adopt electronic medical record systems and finally move away from paper charts, right? So there are a lot of different EMR vendors that popped up out of that act in 2009. So again, a typical patient's data may sit across many different EMR systems. And then furthermore, if you think about just all of the innovation in wearable devices, various health and fitness apps, various forms of diagnostic testing, there's been an explosion of more and more data created about a person's health in the last couple of years, just due to innovation that's popped up across the industry. So when health data sits across many different systems, that makes it very difficult to pull all of those records together in a way that also complies with HIPAA and protects patient privacy. And then lastly, to touch on the lack of nationwide standards for data interchange, we do now have a pretty high rate of patient health records that sit in digital format, but there's been a lack of communication standards across different EMR vendors, and that's hindered the ability to exchange data easily. A lot of these EMR vendors will create proprietary communication and language protocols that make them unable to communicate with other EMR vendors. I read a recent article that said even within the average hospital, they're dealing with 16 different EMR systems that they have to try to connect data across.
That's insane.
Yeah.
That's just not sustainable. And then the final point, which is how do you standardize the different EMRs? And I'm sure that's another challenge that you're facing as well, no doubt.
Yeah, I think the good thing is that industry and government recognize that it's problematic that our health IT infrastructure in this country is not interoperable with each other. So there's a lot of innovation, especially around APIs, such as the recent FHIR exchange, that is really helping to address some of these health data interoperability challenges that I touched upon.
Thinking ahead for data scientists and analysts who are interested in entering the healthcare industry, where do you see the biggest opportunities today?
Well, I think that there are huge opportunities today in what's called real world data, or also commonly shortened to RWD. And RWD is any data generated about a person's health that's collected outside of randomized randomized control trials. So it's really data that's generated about a patient through, their routine care. It could be data that comes from the EMRs, could be data that comes from claims databases, a wearable device, various disease registries. And there's a lot of different applications of RWD right now in healthcare across both, clinical research use cases as well as commercial, right, sales and marketing use cases. So to touch upon, two common use cases for real-world data, in the clinical trial setting, you can use real-world data to create what's called synthetic clinical trial control arms. So instead of having patients receive placebo as the control arm of a clinical trial, you could create a synthetic arm by finding patients who haven't received the study drug through accessing their real-world data. That is a, pretty common use case for real-world data in the clinical trial setting. Now, a common use case in the commercial setting might be a health economics outcome study, also called a HEOR study, or applying predictive modeling techniques to find patients with rare diseases, and then targeting specific outreach to their clinicians or even digital marketing to the patients themselves to inform them about the disease and various therapeutics that they can have access to.
In your opinion, what's been the biggest driving force behind this? Because there's certainly a huge demand for people who have experience in this space and want to go into it. But, behind the scenes, what's pushing this advancement forward?
Well, there's been an explosion of venture funding into the healthcare analytics and health technology space over the last decade. And as part of building their core products and tools, many of these companies need to access patient level, de-identified real world data. And many of these companies are using technologies like Datavant to de-identify, aggregate, and link vast amounts of health data together in a privacy-preserving fashion. So what these companies do is they take the aggregated and linked data to build all sorts of interesting platforms and applications on top of this data. Applications could be understanding the natural history of a disease or assessing how different patients are affected by the disease and how to target them for care. It could be understanding how to better evaluate novel interventions, both during a clinical trial and afterwards. And essentially, these technology companies are taking healthcare research that has traditionally been done on a project by project basis and productizing that whole process so that analyses and insights can be accessed in an always on capacity through the platforms that they have built on top of live data feeds that they aggregate and link from many different data sources.
Excellent. So thinking down to the main users of this innovation and Datavant's customers, can you give us some insight into how this is used by organizations and individuals?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the health technology companies that use this, and then oftentimes they're serving end users in the life science industry. So pharma companies and clinical research organizations are increasingly interested in using real-world data for clinical development of new drugs. Um, Clinical development has become increasingly expensive over time, and it's extremely lengthy. I think on average now it takes 10 years and over $1 billion to bring a drug to market, and that's just not really sustainable. So there's also been a lot of interest in using real-world data in clinical trials that has been accelerated during this recent COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing physicians finally adopting telemedicine. We're seeing drug sponsors implementing digital tools to collect data remotely in order to maintain their ongoing clinical trials. So ultimately, we're seeing pharma and clinical research organizations be really interested in real-world data for clinical trial applications. They're looking to connect the clinical study data to real-world data for various use cases, such as long-term monitoring of safety and efficacy. You can look at the recent COVID-19 vaccines, which were developed, at unprecedented speeds, right? And, the quickness of that clinical trial process means that you don't necessarily have the same duration or depth of trial data available when these vaccines launch. So you could use real world data, these vaccine companies could, to conduct ongoing monitoring of safety and efficacy as vaccines are rolled out across the US population.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And then looking at public health, just being able to have better predictions. Obviously, data-driven insights is massive, but when you touched on the impact for COVID, can you give us some examples of how this real-world data has helped impact COVID in a better way?
Yeah, great question. I think that even beyond pharma companies and clinical research organizations, some of the more traditional users of real-world data, real-world data can be used in the public health setting as well. So, going back to my example of the recent COVID-19 pandemic, I think what we've seen is that it's highlighted how disparate health outcomes can be across the US population along race and socioeconomic lines. Real world data was used to validate that through an effort that Datavant was a part of called the COVID-19 Research Database. And this is a database of de-identified, linkable real world data that was made available pro bono to academic and public health researchers. So because ethnicity and socioeconomic status aren't fields that are typically reported to the CDC, there was no easy way for public health researchers to answer the question of how COVID has been impacting people of different races and ethnicities. Well, researchers working within the COVID-19 research database was able to connect demographic, mortality, and claims data, which filled those data gaps and enabled us to confirm that the pandemic is disproportionately impacting African American, Hispanic, and low-income populations. Overall, I'm really excited about the increasing utility and applicability of real-world data in the years to come across many different stakeholders in healthcare, whether pharma or public health.
Such a great example, and I think it's important to raise awareness of some of the challenges that historical data sets have in terms of biases. So you've made working within data science and healthcare sound very attractive, of course. Can you give us some insight into how data scientists can prepare themselves for a career in applying real-world data into healthcare? What are the opportunities that are out there?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the good thing is that there's really no shortage of opportunities, right? Like as I see this is an industry and a use case that will only grow, and we're really at the cusp of that. So we're at the beginning of a huge growth curve. I think that depending on where you want to work within the healthcare industry, there may be different profiles that hiring managers are looking for. So I talked about, health technology companies needing real world data, pharma companies needing real world data, public health. I think that, for data scientists who may be looking at traditional pharma or clinical research organizations that are using real world data across various applications, the typical background for analysts and researchers who work in this setting have backgrounds in the biological sciences, epidemiology, public health. There are a lot of PharmDs and MDs that work with real world data in the traditional pharma and clinical research industries. In the health technology space, which is much more similar to the technology industry, science and epidemiology backgrounds may not be as important for hiring managers. So I think those would be great industries to break into for someone who doesn't have much of a healthcare background at all. I do think it's definitely helpful to have some basic grounding in the industry, especially understanding the pharmaceutical industry, since this is where real-world data is most used today. Although, health systems and health plans are catching up as well in their usage of real-world data. So for anyone interested in breaking in, I'd suggest getting some experience working with the claims data set, which is the most commonly used health data type in research and analytics. It's helpful to get some familiarity with claims data and understand what's included in this kind of data, how can it be used. I think that hands-on experience is helpful because I think it'll give people an understanding of how extremely messy and oftentimes incomplete health data is. You often need to get data from multiple different sources to get the full picture. And many of our, health technology and analytic companies that we work with at Datavant spend significant amounts of time cleaning, standardizing, and curating health data. Many of which may sit in large unstructured notes fields. So there's a huge data curation and standardization process that needs to happen before the data can even be used for analytics. I think for those people who are interested in breaking into the healthcare data field, getting some hands-on experience and having an appreciation for this can help prepare you for a journey in this field.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We see it time and time again. There's a lot of demand. Many of our partners are within the life sciences and healthcare data space, and we do help individuals make that transition from other industries into healthcare. And the first stop often is in the healthcare claims data space. So for anyone who doesn't have prior healthcare or life sciences experiences, there is a formed path available. Final question for me, Sue. Looking again at your role at Datavant, clearly a very pivotal role in an amazing organization. And anyone who's not familiar with Datavant, I'd recommend you check them out. Look at the parent company, Royavant, who have an incredible track record of setting up amazing companies. looking at 2021, Sue, what are you most excited about for your role, your team, and what sort of growth are you expecting?
I think that I'm super excited about where the future lies for Datavant and the real world data ecosystem more broadly speaking. What I love the most about my role at Datavant is having the opportunity to work with our clients on helping them find the data to solve some really critical business challenges that they're working on, whether it's creating the next innovative health technology platform that needs streams of live data feeding in, whether it's helping to find rare disease patients more effectively and educate them on the various therapeutic options that are out there. I think that we're at the beginning of a huge growth curve for how real world data can be used to improve healthcare for patients. And, Datavant is a very mission-driven organization. Everybody who works there is really oriented around patient impact and helping to improve our healthcare industry. So I think that being around people who are not just, really smart and intelligent and have accomplished amazing things in their career, but people who are, deeply wedded to our vision and our mission, and it gives you an extra boost to get up in the morning and go to work, right? Knowing that we're making such a big impact on an industry. So yeah, I think those are some of the things that I love about my work at Datavant.
Absolutely. Well, Sue, thank you so much for coming on, talking to us about your background, giving us a real detailed education on what it's like to work within healthcare data and the impact of real world data, talking to us about the amazing growth ahead for the industry. Very exciting times, and I appreciate you coming on to talk to us.
No problem. It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Alldus offer an exec search program. Alldus can help you discover how data science and AI can transform your company. With our unrivaled network of C-suite executives and senior AI professionals, we offer retained search services across the US and Europe. Get the Alldus advantage. Become a member of the Alldus community and enjoy some of the following: AI meetups. Once a month, our community gathers to listen to some of the leading experts in the world of data science and AI. Our speakers come from all over the world, including Dublin, Boston, and Frankfurt. We also have our AI mentors. Our experts will provide mentoring to Alldus members. And don't forget our AI in Action podcast. Each week we have guests from all over the world talking us through their education, career, and more. Become an Alldus member and get the Alldus advantage. For more information and to sign up for our newsletter, log on to www.alldus.com. That's www.alldus.com. Alldus International, empowering through AI.